Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of September 25th, 2025. We are coming to you this week, as always, from the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest today is journalist and author Guy Gugliotta. Guy is a graduate of Columbia University and is a Vietnam War veteran. He worked as a reporter for United Press International, the Miami Herald, and the Washington Post. He is the author of several books, including Kings of Cocaine, Inside the Medellin Cartel, an astonishing true story of murder, money, and international corruption, published by Simon & Schuster in 1989, co-authored by Jeff Lean. He is the author of a book entitled Freedom's Cap, The United States Capitol and the Coming of the Civil War, published by Hill and Wang in 2012, and co-editor of a volume entitled Swift Boats at War in Vietnam, published by Stackpole in 2017. His latest book, and the one he is here to talk about with me today, is Grant's Enforcer, Taking Down the Klan, published on April 15th of this year by the University of Georgia Press. It's the story of how, in the years immediately following the Civil War, a Georgian became the Attorney General of the United States in the Grant administration, the first Attorney General to lead the newly created Department of Justice, and how he waged war against the Reconstruction-era Ku Klux Klan. It was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal on July 8th. My conversation with Guy Gugliotta begins now. Guy Gugliotta. And I just messed up your last name. You'll have to say it for despite practicing with you. Welcome to our podcast, sir.
Well, thanks. You did fine. Gugliotta is just great.
Gugliotta. You have written a book. You're a longtime journalist and author, many years' experience as a reporter, and you have tackled a subject that few people have. You've written a book published by our friends at the University of Georgia Press entitled Grant's Enforcer, Taking Down the Klan, which is about, of course, the Grant in the title is President Ulysses S. Grant, and the enforcer was a man named Amos Akerman, who is not known by very many, even those who read Reconstruction history, and there aren't many people who do that. How did a reporter with your background and all the things that you've written about, how did you get interested in this very specific subject and this man?
Well, I guess it was just before the pandemic, or even at the beginning of the pandemic. As a Christmas present, I got a copy of the Ron Chernow biography of Grant. And I think most people probably put it down after Appomattox, but I read through his presidency, which was not very well received by historians. But during his first term, he was tremendously active in furthering the rights of freed people, of the freed blacks. And he enlisted Amos T. Akerman as his Attorney General, a transplanted Northerner, but a lifetime Georgian, as his Attorney General to further the campaign to improve the lives of recently freed Black folks, and to take the teeth out of the Ku Klux Klan, which was tremendously active at that time in the late 1860s and the early 1870s.
Tell us a little bit, if you will, about who Amos Akerman was. Give us a thumbnail sketch of his biography and what brought him to the place where he could become attorney. He was not the first attorney general, but he was the first attorney general to head the Department of Justice. Is that correct?
That is right. And I can't even tell you if he knew that when he became the Attorney General. He had, as I say, he was born in New Hampshire, moved to Georgia after graduating from Dartmouth College. He had I think, recurring pleurisy, lung problems, and he needed to be outdoors, but he needed to be outdoors in a warm climate. He loved Georgia, and for that reason, and spent a lot of time outside. He didn't read law until the late 1840s, and he became a lawyer just about, I believe, I'm going to say 1842, 1843. Was quite successful before the Civil War, owned slaves, uh, joined the Confederate Army as a quartermaster. Uh, Following the war, or immediately after the war, he converted to Republicanism and became a Republican. I am not sure exactly why this was, but there are hints in his letters and in his memoirs. He uh, really disliked the Buchanan administration before the war. He was an odd person for that time in that he was a very strong believer in a strong federal government. And this was, before the Civil War and even after, states' rights were sacrosanct. He wanted a strong federal government, and he thought Buchanan was weak. Um, and obviously, Grant was strong. And so he converted to Republicanism, campaigned for Grant in 1868 when Grant won the presidency, and later that year became the U.S. Attorney for Georgia. And Georgia was still not a state; it was still in rebellion. And Georgia was the last state to be readmitted to the Union. But he was the U.S. Attorney for Georgia, and Grant just reached down and plucked him out in the middle of 1870 to become Attorney General. There's a lot of dispute, or some dispute, about why this was. Um, but my belief is that Grant wanted someone to go after the Ku Klux Klan and to bring it to heel. And Akerman turned out to be that man.
You mentioned that he served in the Confederacy. You also note he never saw combat while he was serving. He moved to Savannah at some point in the antebellum period because you mentioned that he studied law with John McPherson Berrien, who had been Andrew Jackson's Attorney General. So he was right here in our fair city.
That's right, he was indeed. And for the most part, he lived in central North Georgia and close to South Carolina. But yes, he did live. He did live in Savannah. I think what's another important thing, Stan, here is that he was a very early advocate of the 14th Amendment.
I was going to ask you about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the equality before the law. And in his first introduction to Washington politics, he testified before Congress about whether Georgia should be readmitted to the Union. This occurred in just around Christmas in 1868, and the 14th Amendment had just been ratified only 4 or 5 months before that. And the 14th Amendment guaranteed rights, guaranteed civil rights, and guaranteed equality before the law for any person in the United States. Any person, no other adjectives. And it was Akerman's point of view, which he stated before Congress, that this meant, as far as he was concerned, that the federal government could intervene on the part of anyone whose rights had been violated or who had been denied equality before the law in any circumstance. And what he said this could be done with, and his belief was that the Ku Klux Klan, which at that time was running rampant pretty much, well, Georgia at that point was the focal point, said the federal government could use the federal courts rather than local courts to prosecute civil rights violations as violations of the Constitution, of the 14th Amendment. Could use the 14th Amendment as the tool to do this. And like I say, 18 months later, he was hired as Grant's Attorney General.
And to set the scene for our audience who may not be as well versed in this period, we're talking about the period immediately after the Civil War when the newly freed black men, at least, were getting involved in politics. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, was recognized that their survival really nationally would depend upon how much they could engage black voters in the South. And of course, white Southerners were primarily Democrats. This was the party, their words, of white supremacy, of returning. While they recognized black people were free, that is about all they were willing to recognize. They certainly didn't want them voting or holding office. And so this gave rise to the Klan as a sort of secret arm, the military arm of the Democratic Party that tried to enforce voter intimidation and violence against black voters. This was going on, and there was no Civil Rights Act. There was no federal Civil Rights Act. There's no federal enforcement of voting laws. The 14th and 15th Amendment were really the first attempts by the federal government to enforce and ensure the right to vote. And as you say, the use of the federal government to ensure civil rights to all people. And of course, now the 14th Amendment is in the news because of the birthright citizenship clause. And so it's come back into prominence in our own time. So having set that stage, talk about how somebody like Akerman, who, as you mentioned, was really in his mind a lifelong Georgian, how did he come to become such a staunch advocate of black civil rights? Because that put him in opposition to about 99% of all white Southerners.
Well, I think, as I say, he really respected Grant. He believed that after the surrender, the South had lost the war. It was time for the South and for him to get in step with the nation again and to move forward. He felt that if the former Confederacy and Georgia in particular couldn't make the adjustment and couldn't make the adjustment to change its way of life, that they would be stuck behind for generations, that they would be buried, they would be surpassed for generations. And he believed that you lost the war, that way of life is over, do something else, move on. And his viewpoint is, as you mentioned, Stan, for Democrats and for white Southerners was absolutely, that was anathema. And the bitterness and the hatred burned as brightly as ever during that period. And he was respected, but never loved. And what he thought was way ahead of his time. This is the dawn of the civil rights movement, I believe. And this is the dawn of the civil rights movement. And but it took another 90 years for the civil rights movement to take root in the country.
As a writer coming to this subject, again, this is fascinating because how do we know what we know about the Reconstruction Ku Klux Klan? One of the things you talk about, and I've read through these, at least for the volumes on Georgia, the testimony of people who sat before some of the joint congressional committees investigating violence in the South. Tell us a little bit about the Klan, where it came from. at this period, its first iteration of the Klan, and what it was doing specifically. Some of the outrages, and I put quotes around that because that's what they were called, that they were committing as night riders in the South.
Well, it began as a fairly innocent drinking club in Tennessee, and it's and there's a bunch of I think there are 6 or 7 founders, young former Confederate officers, didn't have a whole lot to do after the surrender, sat around getting drunk and getting dressing up in costumes and going out and just sort of raising hell, but not doing anything particularly nasty. In 1868, it was in 1868 with the passage of the first civil rights law, which allowed blacks to vote in that election, changed the nature of the Ku Klux Klan completely. It was taken over by very heavy duty Southern whites, former generals. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the famed Confederate cavalry leader, was the titular head of the Ku Klux Klan. John Bell Gordon, a Georgia general, was the and later a senator, later a U.S. senator, was the known head of the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia. And so what happened was that in 1868, the Klan spread across the former Confederacy, and it was no longer a funny drinking club. Now its main mission was to make sure that blacks did not vote, and to make sure that, if possible, that they did not hold office. And as you said, that they were free, but that was pretty much it. And to do this, they used intimidation, beatings, rock throwings. But basically, what they did was white terrorism. And they dressed up in costumes, got on horses, did home invasions, beat up men, beat up people, raped women, and stole guns, stole property, robbed people. And they did mostly blacks, but also white supporters of black rights. And what happened was that in certain states, Louisiana comes to mind, Louisiana, Tennessee come to mind, violence was pretty much constant at a very high level in Louisiana, a relatively low level in Tennessee. But the focal point of violence tended to shift, and in 1868, Georgia was the main place, and then in 1869, North Carolina became very much the focal point. And then in 1870, when Amos T. Akerman was appointed Attorney General, the emphasis shifted to South Carolina.
And talk about his, it's very controversial when he went up and he testified, you mentioned, in front of a congressional committee, which, by the way, was compiling evidence. They were taking evidence, they were interviewing witnesses from the South and taking evidence about Klan outrages, and these were published in large, thick volumes, and they've really kind of provided the evidence that most historians have relied on as to what was going on with this, quote, secret organization, because newspapers, as you point out, were notoriously unreliable. Most newspapers were Democratic. And so they sort of downplayed or denied the existence of this organization at all. It seemed to be all relying upon black witnesses, which they denigrated as being totally unreliable or paid off by corrupt Republicans. Have I got that all that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I think I noticed that in examining newspaper accounts, black folks were never interviewed, and so that the whole chronicle of this is skewed uh, toward the white viewpoints, and so the blacks never get an airing. You mentioned the report of the Joint Select Committee. So the most extraordinary congressional document that I've ever seen. I mean, it's 30,000 pages or so of just bald testimony from victims of the Ku Klux Klan, members of the Ku Klux Klan, leaders of the Ku Klux Klan, uh, uh, politicians, army officers, everybody connected with this. It's just, and they're just plugged them in, told them to just tell their story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an extraordinary document. Anybody who tunes in on C-SPAN today and listens to the bloviating that happens in congressional committees should read this. And because this is an absolutely extraordinary document.
Yeah, it's riveting stuff. I've read the volumes for Georgia, but as you say, there are many others for the other southern states. And again, to be clear, the Democrats said this was all made up because it was simply used to try to justify continued military occupation of certain parts of the South. That this wasn't real, none of this was going on, it was all downplayed. And then the heavy hand of the federal government was coming in by the 14th and 15th Amendment. So talk us and walk us through how what became known as the Enforcement Acts, which is what Attorney General Akerman used to try to bring the Klan to heel, primarily in South Carolina. We've been talking about Georgia, but it was primarily your story also centers in York County, South Carolina. You introduce us to the people there, black, white, Democrats, and Republicans. It was like a battleground. It's almost like nothing you've ever read. In American history, if you're not familiar with this is an incredible story. Then you tell it from Washington and on the ground in the South.
Well, yeah, I think what happened was that Akerman, in consultation with General Alfred Terry, who was the military leader of the Union Army forces stationed in the South, decided that if you wanted to get rid of the Ku Klux Klan, the best strategy would be to focus on one small area and let the federal government come down really hard on this one small area. And if you did it right, then the demonstration effect would show the rest of the South what could happen. So you needed a strong law, and so they picked York County. Enforcement acts are what we now call today enabling legislation. You have the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment preserves or consecrates equality before the law. So how do you enforce that? Well, what you have to do is you have to describe exactly what the federal government is going to do, what the penalties are, what the crimes are, and then you have to describe how it's going to be enforced. And there were 3 enforcement acts. The first and the third are the important ones. And the first enforcement act prohibited mass riders from riding around terrorizing people at night. and provided penalties for those who did that. The Third Enforcement Act did the same thing and described the penalties, including the death penalty for crimes committed by masked groups uh, traveling at night or in just terrorizing people for voting and for civil rights violations of other kinds. In it also, and this was a key point, it also allowed the government to suspend habeas corpus for those arrested, which meant that the government could arrest the federal government, and by federal government, read U.S. Marshals and Army officers, could arrest people on suspicion of being members of the Ku Klux Klan, throw them in jail, and leave them there until trial. This was a huge advance in that what had ordinarily happened is that people had been arrested, put in jail, and then freed pretty much immediately to await trial, during which time they would either leave or get their defense together and just abandon the country. And now they couldn't do that, and with the enforcement acts. And this was the tool that Akerman used to go after the Ku Klux Klan, focusing on a small county in northern South Carolina, York County, and demonstrating that if he could take down the Ku Klux Klan in that county, we're talking like 400 or 500 people. And if he could take down the Klan in that county, then Klansmen throughout the South would see that federal law enforcement could work, and they would stop doing it.
And to be clear, in the cases before this was a federal offense, whenever things came to trial, usually the jury was made up of white Southerners, probably former Confederates, who just simply refused to believe black witnesses, and they could almost never get a conviction of any Klan outrages. And what Akerman was able to do, I think, with the help of Terry and the Enforcement Act, was seat jurors who could take what they called an ironclad oath, which I'm guessing are people then who could say, I've never sat in rebellion or never was in rebellion against the U.S. government, did not serve in the Confederacy, and they were able to see jurors like that. Is that right?
No, that's not quite right,
Okay.
Dan. It was an ironclad oath, but the oath that the jurors had to take was that they had never been a member of the Ku Klux Klan.
That's right. Gotcha.
And never been sympathizers with the Ku Klux Klan, financed the Ku Klux Klan, had anything to do with the Ku Klux Klan. And but as far as former members of the Confederacy or former Confederate supporters, that was not necessarily the case.
That's a different oath. That was at a different time, right? Yes. Yeah, I conflated those two. Thank you for clearing that up. But it made it immensely easier to get convictions on federal counts.
Sure. Yeah, it did. And the thing about it is that you do need, I think, to keep in mind that for the Republicans, particularly in Washington, this was also, it was quite political, and in that indeed, instead of state courts with juries packed with with white sympathizers, you had federal courts with juries packed with blacks, and so that the ordinary the state court problem was sort of turned on its head. uh, and the and the white defendants and the whites didn't really understand this at all. They they had trouble recognizing that that black jurors could even understand what was going on, and they understood perfectly.
Hmm. And all of this, successful as it was, and particularly it looks now from our vantage point as if Akerman was this champion of civil rights. None of this made him more popular, even with his obviously with white Southerners, but not with his Republican colleagues. And his tenure came to an end at the Justice Department by 1872. Walk us through that.
Yeah, and I think another thing to really understand is that the North was appalled by Ku Klux Klan outrages, but deep down inside, there wasn't anybody uh, in the United States. The black folks really had no constituency, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, the it was easy for Northerners to be appalled by what was going on in the South, but you know it wasn't in their backyard, and so they didn't really care. The people who cared were mostly dead, as beginning with Lincoln, assassinated. Thaddeus Stevens died in 1868. Sumner died in 1870, 1871. So all of the lions of the abolition movement were pretty much gone.
Mm-hmm.
And so that left a core of uh, an interesting core of people composed mostly of former soldiers, former Union soldiers, who had shed blood, rivers of blood, to free the slaves, and people like Akerman, who had been totally radicalized by um, trying to bring justice to blacks in a very, very hostile environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so by 1872, when Akerman left, and he was only the Attorney General for 18 months, but by 1872, Grant was involved in a very what he thought was a very contentious reelection fight, and where he was supposed to be the champion of black rights at a time when the Republican Party was thinking, it's time to move on. It's time to stop doing this. It's time to stop occupying the South. It's time to welcome them back in um, and rather than oppose these people or this group that called the liberal Republicans or the liberals, rather than oppose them, Grant, in typical political fashion, moved to accommodate them.
Mm-hmm.
And Akerman was outside that circle. And by the time he left, he was the most radical member of the cabinet. And
Mm.
boy, the rest of his cabinet colleagues really didn't want to hear from him anymore.
Yeah, you tell a great story about, I think it's Hamilton Fish, who was Secretary of State, who every week in the cabinet meeting, Amos Akerman would show up and recount a litany of outrages that had happened somewhere in the South, and just one horrible thing after another. And rather than having the desired effect of shocking everyone into sort of saying, let's do something about this, they were just like, really, this again? You bring this in here every week. It's tedious to listen to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly right. And they had, yeah, and they didn't really, they didn't like him much to start with, and they really didn't like him after a while. Um, and the other thing, he was tasked with getting the Department of Justice up and running, and neither he nor Grant nor the rest of the cabinet was particularly interested in this because the Department of Justice was put in place to it was a good government initiative by Congress. The idea was that every department, which used to hire their own attorneys, would instead rely on this package of attorneys that would be in the Department of Justice. And Grant in particular, Grant in particular is that he liked patronage, and he liked giving lawyers jobs and in his department. So did the rest of the cabinet. And Akerman didn't particularly care one way or the other. And so it's the Department of Justice languished. It didn't even have a building. And uh, so that there was that. And then his deputy, the Solicitor General, was also backstabbing him and saying how incompetent he was and that he didn't keep up with his Supreme Court obligations and all of this other stuff, which was true. I mean, Akerman was, as far as I could tell, was like 80, 90% of the time was
Mhm.
tracking down the Ku Klux Klan. That's all he cared about.
Mhm. And we think of the Department of Justice now; it's one of the largest, obviously, federal operations. Yeah, the FBI and all of the things that they do. The Attorney General is a very powerful figure in the modern cabinet. None of that was true. You talk about the stories about him basically having to scrounge up desks and closets and in other departments. Added to the fact that no one really trusted him because he was a former Confederate, and the Republicans were suspicious of his loyalty, and of course the White South felt like he was a turncoat.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and especially, and he became a convenient whipping boy in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And he had his moments where his prestige was very high, but then but for the most part, uh, when something went wrong, other people may have been involved in it too, but they picked on him because he was easy.
Mm-hmm. And I won't ask you to describe this, and it's hard. It's one of the impenetrable parts of this whole story, not necessarily the way you wrote it, but is his involvement with the railroads. I know that he was asked several times to weigh in on legalities with some of the railroad trusts, and he didn't. He sort of came down against them, and that didn't do him any favors in Grant's cabinet either. I know that was part of his downfall.
Well, I think he believed that that was his downfall, that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
he had irritated the Union Pacific people and later on the Central Pacific people. These are the two halves of the Transcontinental Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And there's questions of roots and questions of just questions of responsibilities, debt repayment, things of that sort. Very complicated, and he sided with the federal government and in opposition to Congress on a couple of occasions, and really got his hands slapped because of that. He thought that. Um, how do I put this? I thought he was quite naive in this. It's probably unheard of today, but back in the 1860s, large numbers of Congress people, senators, representatives, and even the vice president of the United States held stock in the Union Pacific, and so that if you were going to cause the stock price to tumble, which he did because he said that he ruled that Union Pacific had to pay interest on its debt uh, in a timely manner, and the Union Pacific was practically bankrupt at the time, and the stock price went down from something like $25 to like $3 in the space of about a month and a half, and so that um, he had to know, or he should have known, that Congress, having lots of members who were stakeholders in the Union Pacific, wasn't going to stand for that. And basically, Congress like slapped him on the wrist and said, you know, the Union Pacific doesn't have to pay interest on your schedule because we say so. And that was it.
Mhm.
And he won the second argument by saying the same thing. The Central Pacific came to him asking for a route change, and he said, "No, you got to take that up with Congress." And and that's none of my business. And but yeah, and he believed, I think that he believed that this was why he got dumped, and I think it had more to do with Grant trying to appease the liberal Republicans and keep his party together. But that's probably an argument for another day.
And asked for his resignation early in 1872, and so his 2-year reign came to an end. It was pretty quick, and in the grand annals of the United States, very small, but at the same time, he made an enormous impact, you believe. That's sort of the point of your book, that he was successful in taking down the Reconstruction Klan.
He was, and he didn't do it the way he wanted to. He wanted to use the 14th Amendment to take him down, to do what has been done since the 1960s, 100 years later. In other words, regard the crimes, regard hate crimes as violations of civil rights, so that if you were to murder someone, rape someone's daughter, steal from someone, while you were violating that person's civil rights, and in doing that, violating that person's civil rights, you could be arrested and tried for even capital crimes. Um, and instead, he brought that forward during trials in Columbia, South Carolina in late 1871. Brought that forward, and the court knocked it down. His fallback, though, was to use the 15th Amendment, violation of voting rights, and he obtained countless convictions on that. And because the Klan would raid a black family, take the men out and forbid them to vote Republican, and would violate their voting rights. And so they were imprisoned for this. It's had its drawbacks in that crimes against women and children could not be tried there because women and children didn't vote. And but he obtained 50 convictions in the first tranche of trials in Columbia, the famous trials, and then over the next period of a couple of years, when he wasn't even the Attorney General, there were several hundred more convictions for voting rights violations. But the 14th Amendment, which was what he really wanted to use, was not brought into play on a major basis until as civil rights legislation, or as a civil rights law, until the 1960s.
And and wouldn't really that would really ultimately be his legacy, I suppose. That happened 100 years, 90 years later, but it did, as Dr. King said, the moral arc of the universe bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. And obviously, Akerman didn't live to see that. You noted that he left office in 1872. He returned to Georgia and practiced law for the remaining few years of his life. He died at the age of 59, I think, in 1880. Not long after this, he did not have a long life. What was his life like when he came back to Georgia? How was he received?
Uh, like I say, I think he was received with respect. Respect, not love, but respect, and he remained a civil rights advocate to the end of his life, and he was very successful. And he was a hell of an attorney. I mean, he provided for his family. All seven of his kids went to college. All seven of his sons went to college. His widow lived deep into the 20th century, and he died of rheumatic fever in 1880. But he died a relatively wealthy man, and he never backed away. And and he had respect. There's one obituary written anonymously by a rival, said that wrote that he had tremendous integrity, and even though I never agreed with him, he was a terrific lawyer, and deserved all our respect.
And for those who are interested, he is buried in Cartersville Oak Hill Cemetery. The Georgia Historical Society put up a historical marker at the site of his home in Cartersville in 2019. So he's buried on Georgia soil. One of the things I want to end with here, in your acknowledgments, you go through and talk about the people who helped you with this book and who loaned you sources, some of which are still in private hands. One of the things you say at the very end, you say there is a hope, much more to come. There is, I know, much more to be done. What do you mean by that? What does Guy Gugliotta think is left to be done about this subject?
Well, I think one thing I think needs to be done is that we have to hear more of the voices of Reconstruction. The report of the Joint Select Committee that we talked about earlier, it's an extraordinary document. Historians have been using this for a long time, and but they use it. They've used it in spots, or they've used it in pieces. What I tried to do was I used both. I used the report in conjunction with newspapers to do my best to stay in the moment. And by that, I mean to have the people say what they said at the time it happened, to understand what people knew about a particular event at the time it happened, to make it as on time and with the voices of the people who actually did the crime, who actually experienced the crime, who actually were there at the time that it happened. In addition to the Select Committee report, I believe the tool that helped me the most were and this has happened only in the last 10 or so years, digitizing newspapers. Several organizations, instead of like scrolling through microfilm frame by frame to find out what you need, you can just plug in somebody's name, or you can plug in an event, and you can get 10, 15, 20 sources, different interpretations of a particular event. And it gives you a context, that you didn't have before. In other words, instead of depending on one or two interpretations in one or two big newspapers, you could get half a dozen interpretations from a dozen newspapers. I think I quote from something in the nature of 12 or 14 newspapers in South Carolina alone, that that contributed material for me. And what, as a journalist, um, I find, we're supposed to be the first draft of history, and but the thing is, it's more than that, because what we do, or what we do as journalists, is we write what's happening as it happens. This is what is known at the time. And I make the point a couple of times in this book that it was very important to prove that the Ku Klux Klan was a conspiracy. And the only thing that people had to go on, that Akerman had to go on in this, was an interview that Nathan Bedford Forrest gave to a paper in Cincinnati in 1868, describing the Ku Klux Klan. And he was really proud of it. And then 2 days later, he tried to take it back, because tried to take it all back. And then 2 years later, he took it all back when he was interviewed by the select committee. But the thing is, this is all people had to work with. And so one of the things Akerman had to do was he had to find somebody who could show him, or could tell him, that there was a conspiracy in York County, South Carolina, by the Ku Klux Klan. And he spent a lot of time doing this, and succeeded admirably in finding the bylaws, and in identifying the conspiracy. But I guess the point I want to make is that historians in the past have sort of said, well, the Ku Klux Klan, and it was like the Ku Klux Klan like jumped into existence, and its existence was taken for granted by 1870, 2 years after it was formed. Not so. And that's not so. And it's these digitized newspapers, these multiple accounts, that give you the sense of how people were able to, and very able to, say, oh, that doesn't exist, because nobody had ever said so. They didn't know. They didn't know because there was no information. Sorry, this is long-winded, but
No, not at all.
But it's very important, and it's very important to know what people knew at the time. And for that, these digitized newspapers, and the ability to use these gives a historian, particularly a narrative historian, like I aspire to be, it gives me a tremendous leg up. And it's you find out what's real, what's not real, what's legend, what's rumor. Rumors are important because people believe rumors at the time they occur. And if you're a historian and you say, well, that's not really what happened, that doesn't matter. What happens is what people thought at the time. And to get a true understanding of how something developed, you have to know what happened, when it happened, and what people felt about it when it happened. And there's this is an amazing this is, turned out to be an amazing development. I started off writing this. I thought I was going to write sort of a faction book, and um, faction book and sort of do atmospherics or something. But then when I got into it and saw the power of these newspapers, my idea was to put you in York County and let you see what everybody else saw in York County. I want you to be in York County in 1870, 1871. I want you to be there. And I want you to see what they saw, read what they read, understand what they understood, and know what they knew. And because then you get the why and the how in much more detail.
And I think you succeed admirably in all of those. I do have to ask, did your research take you to modern day York County, South Carolina? And if you did, is there anything left of any of this? Is there any public acknowledgement that this ever happened? And are there any people there who are willing to talk to you about any of it, descendants? What's on the ground now?
No descendants. I did. I went. It's a lovely place. It's a bedroom community for Charlotte, North Carolina. Actually, it's about I think it's about 25-minute drive from the Charlotte airport. Um, and in many cases, the downtown Yorkville, which where most of the book takes place, is pretty much exactly the same. The buildings are many of the buildings are there, and it's historically. I mean, it's historically preserved. And as far as acknowledging what went on there, yes, they do. And there is there's a historical society up there in York County, and they've done an admirable job, particularly describing the lynching of Jim Williams. And they have one of the leaders of the Klan, J. Rufus Bratton, his family estate is preserved, and his family estate is preserved, and you can see where Jim Williams' body was laid out. And
Is the site of the lynching, do we know where that happened? Is it still extant?
yeah, we know approximately where it happened, but no, that one is not. We know where the Klan gathered to plan the lynching. I found the street. I found the roads that they mentioned, the routes that they mentioned. I know how the county was structured and where X, Y, and Z are, and it's there's all kinds of there's hardwood forest all over the place, and pine trees too, and I believe it probably outside the towns. It looks pretty much the same as it always did. Yorkville, as I say, is very well preserved, historically preserved. The largest town, the largest town in the county is Rock Hill, and that's pretty modern, different place. But yeah, it was great going down there, and folks were very, very helpful to me.
That's good to hear. Well, of course, the Klan went on to continue in existence through the 1920s, a formidable force then, and into the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. Your book is the story of the first Klan and the first federal law enforcement officer who took them on. The title of the book is Grant's Enforcer, Taking Down the Klan. The author is Guy Gugliotta.
Very good.
The publisher is, thank you. The publisher is the University of Georgia Press. This has been out since April 15th. You can find it anywhere you buy books. Sir, thank you so much for coming on here. Continued good luck as you get out and promote the book and talk about it and all the other projects you've got going on.
Well, my pleasure, Stan, and you take care.
My thanks to Guy Gugliotta for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at ugapress.org. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Krellin. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, which would be most appreciated. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Beaten Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out my videos, my blog, and similar podcasts with great writers like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.